I'm Luca Giliberti, contributing writer at Gold Derby, joined today by Ophelia Lovibond, who starred as Joyce on HBO Max's Minx. Ophelia, when you were handed the character of Joyce, a feminist in 1970s United States with a longtime dream of starting a women's magazine, what would you say became the foundation for finding her essence and then building your performance around that?
Well, it came primarily from the writing. A lot, Ellen Rappaport, a lot of the character was there on the page for you. So it wasn't like you had to kind of search for who she was. To me, it was quite self-evident who this person was, which is helpful when you just respond kind of instinctively to someone. But kind of going deeper than that, I was already familiar with lots of the kind of feminist literature because it's something I've been interested in for a long time. But I just familiarize myself with a lot of the kind of literature that she would have been reading, and nothing beyond 71, and just kind of apply any books that she mentioned in the script I read, any kind of oblique references I kind of found, I made sure I knew what they were. So just and looked at loads and loads of imagery of kind of women in the 70s and just ensconced myself in that whole kind of era.
And you mentioned the feminist literature. Was there anything specifically that you were able to draw or deduce from it? And if so, how much of it did you actually infuse into the character of Joyce ultimately?
Well, she talks very highly of a book called Our Bodies, Ourselves, which was a sort of a kind of a book that was kind of helping women understand what their bodies did and how they worked, and because obviously a lot of kind of medical literature is written by men, and so they don't necessarily go into kind of more detail in kind of quite an explicit way. It's very kind of, it really goes there. And Joyce sort of thinks it's brilliant and is so enthused by it, and I was not familiar with it at all, so I ordered an original copy off eBay, the one that wouldn't have been re-edited. And so whenever Joyce mentioned that, I knew I had the images in my mind, and I kind of knew the chapter she was talking about, and the fact that she would even reference them said a lot about what Joyce was like, that she would be referencing a specific footnote on a certain page. And her hero is Gloria Steinem, so I've looked at I'm a massive fan of Gloria Steinem myself, but looked at kind of lots of her writing and her contemporaries as well. It was fun to kind of dive into it all.
Wow, that's fascinating, and that's a lot of reading. So
yeah. Well, I do share that with Joyce. I'm a big reader, so it was a kind of a happy task.
Well, that's good. And you've also talked about, the first episode really delineating these characters so clearly, specifically Joyce. And you've talked about that you really drew on some of those details that you have in that first episode. So could you elaborate on some of those specific details that helped you characterize Joyce instantaneously from that pilot script?
The fact that she thought, there's an instance where she is catcalled by a construction worker, and instead of kind of walking on, she kind of weighs up the situation and thinks, no, I'm going to go and speak to him and try and educate him. And it's kind of vaguely patronizing, but very well intentioned. And instead of kind of just telling him to leave her alone or ignoring him, she tries to re-educate him. Right. And I've not tried that tactic myself, but I've tried many different tactics. But I thought that, but even the fact that she thought that could be effective, there was something quite naive about it. There was something, and that to me was a really kind of helpful insight into Joyce's kind of, she lives kind of in her head in quite a theory-based way. Practically speaking, she doesn't really know how to operate entirely outside of the library. She kind of thinks, well, this is what I've read in the book that you ought to do, so I'm going to do it and it's going to work. And the fact that she doesn't realize it's not going to work, he'll just make even more fun of you in this particular instance, and she's really surprised by it. That was a big insight into Joyce's kind of naivety and her well-meaning attitude, albeit slightly condescending.
Right. That's yeah, I absolutely love that first episode, and like you've talked about, really delineates those characters so clearly. And I actually went back and rewatched it after finishing the show, and I think
But did
you just realized, yeah, there's so much there's not just table setting, there's so much character work that already starts in that episode. And I think it's such a treat if you go back and actually rewatch it after you've watched the entire show. So I
It
hope a
is,
lot of people do that.
yeah, it's very, I mean, that was so remarkable actually about the pilot, because it did set up all of the characters, not just Joyce,
Mhm.
really clearly. They were so clearly delineated, and it was
Exactly.
how Joyce responds to the other characters and was also insightful. That was another way
Mhm.
of providing insight. Like, for example, when she kind of says to Adara Victor's character, and she says to Tina, like, she asks her to get a drink, and Adara points out, like, oh,
Mhm.
I'm not the secretary, I'm just
Yeah.
black. And in fact, she is essentially the secretary, but she's pointing out that Joyce has made this assumption, and and then Joyce is completely startled and doesn't quite know how to get out of it. And then she tries to overcorrect, and then something kind of digs a bigger hole for herself. And that, again, those responses, you kind of go, God, she really has lived quite a sheltered life. Like, everything is kind of about theory and based in
Absolutely.
books, and when she's put into the real world, she's not as effective.
Oh, absolutely. And before we move on from episode one, I do briefly want to mention Rachel Lee Goldenberg, who directed that episode, in fact, the first three episodes, and then also episode 8. Talk a little bit about how she set the tone, not just for the show in general, but also for your working environment, essentially.
Well, Rachel, she's just she's an utterly brilliant director. Like, she's so nuanced, and she's applies so much thought to every moment. And then when you would be filming it, she would suggest, she'd give you a piece of direction, you try it that way, and then we try it maybe 5, 6, 7 other ways. It was all very detailed, and I love doing that, because you start portraying scenes and lines in ways that hadn't occurred to you, that then kind of ricochet off in another direction and send the scene in another direction. So I feel the way that Rachel set the tone for the rest, that kind of, for us to kind of leap off from for the rest of the show, was very helpful in kind of understanding how, I don't know, how nuanced it all could be, and how different it, like, there's not one way to play any of it. And again, with the interaction with the other characters was really helpful.
And I think, sometimes when you just get to experiment with the lines and with some of the dialogue, that's practically a form of rehearsal, wouldn't you say? That it really helps you to get into that rhythm. And as you said, you just explore so many different things when you actually get to, experiment a bit with the dialogue and with the lines.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, we knew there was, again, with Ellen's kind of creation of these characters, we felt we knew who they were, but Rachel she would just, even if it was totally in turning it on its head, you might go in there and think that you'd be really confident about a certain thing. I'm trying to think of a specific example. She would then suggest, well, why don't we have you be really, really shy and not quite understand, you don't really know how to express yourself yet, and you're kind of stumbling with it, and you think, oh, that's not how I'd seen it, and then you try it and you see something else happen. And she did, Rachel had thought about, like, all of the props. There was so much attention to detail with that, and really thinking, would this person have this? It just, there was so much detail.
that's wonderful. And I think that, starts a really great season. And what I love about Joyce throughout the season, especially as we see, is that she is such a bundle of contradictions. She obviously has the passion and the drive, but what we see throughout the season is that sometimes she kind of has her blinders on, and she becomes her own obstacle in quite a few occasions. So could you elaborate on those contradictions and how you navigated them throughout the season?
Well, again, I think Joyce was always coming from a point of being really well-meaning, and
Mhm.
she is her own kind of worst enemy sometimes, because she's very ideological and quite, I mean, not puritanical, that's too extreme, but she's quite a purist, and she's not really applied these notions outside of kind of academia. So I think the kind of a lot of the humor from the show comes from supplanting her from her kind of academic world, at Vassar, and putting her in a porno office. Like, let's see how this works.
Exactly.
Let's see how your idea of what feminism means and what it looks like and how it operates. Let's see how it stands up in a world where you're encountering women very different to yourself. And it kind of, throughout the series, I hope you then see that her feminism, her understanding of it, become more robust and more malleable. And she's been, she's unintentionally been quite close-minded because she simply hasn't encountered anyone that different from herself before. So
Right.
that, I think that's what you see with the show, is you see her realize that she's been quite ignorant.
Mm-hmm. And to sort of piggyback off of that, throughout the season, Joyce really encounters people from all different walks of life. I mean,
Yes.
women in particular, from Shelley to the mob wives in episode 5. What we really see is that she's willing to learn and that she's willing to listen in order to evolve. You've already touched on this a bit, but what would you say are some of the main or most significant things that she learns about herself and the cause she's supporting throughout the season?
Well, I think one of the most significant things she learns about herself is that she can be sexual, and that she can have desire, she can have an active sexual appetite. That doesn't mean she won't be taken seriously. Like, she has a point where she says, women can't be more than one thing. You've got to focus on one thing, because you lose focus and it can be all torn asunder. But she learns that she's quite afraid of that side of herself, I think, because she just simply hasn't really indulged it. So that's one of the key things, is she becomes more kind of, not just accepting, but just kind of proud of it. Like, she's just like, why have I been denying this part of myself? And there's all this free love out there, and I've not been having any of it. And I think she says that in, I think, I can't remember what episode it is, but she says that at one point to Richie. And I think she also learns that her way of communicating sometimes can be quite off-putting, and not that you need to kind of make feminism really palatable. It's not that, but just she sometimes speaks in a way that she sort of doesn't invite people to really listen, to really have a conversation. And I think you see her realize, when she goes to the campus and there are lots of these girls that are just sort of yelling at her, she realizes, I've done that, and it's not really, we're not having a conversation here, and I'm realizing that this isn't the best way.
And one of my favorite scenes is when Joyce and Shelley have that conversation about self-pleasure, and Shelley almost teasingly punctuates that relying on men for sexual pleasure is not very feminist. That's one of the earlier scenes that really stuck out to me, and I thought that was really, I don't know, that really...
and she hasn't, that's something that you realize Joyce hasn't thought about that. She's just not been challenged. She's not thought about it. And then to have her older sister, who's married with kids, like, telling her, I think she's realizing that there are valuable points from many different people, and she's just not thought about them.
Absolutely. And building on Joyce encountering all these people from different walks of life, what this meant for you as an actor is that you got to play off of a number of different actors, including some incredible guest stars like Hope Davis and Alison Tolman and Taylor Zakar Perez, who has some of the best lines on the show, and many more. How did having these constantly changing scene partners, how did that really help you in developing Joyce over the course of the season?
I mean, it was so exciting each time you get a new script, and then you'd see, exactly that, how you would learn more about Joyce from how she'd respond to people. So, right. I mean, the Hope Davis role is brilliant, because she's like one of her heroes, and she's just so excited to meet her, and she's flabbergasted when she walks onto the Dick Cavett show, and there she is, only to discover that she hates her magazine. She hates everything that she's written. It's completely, her stomach just drops, and she just realizes, but I thought you would love this. And again, Hope Davis is kind of positing a point of view that she hasn't thought about. But then when it's kind of, you see reaction to Hope Davis, you see his character change as well. You see, the way he kind of doubles down on his stance, and he doesn't kind of join forces with Joyce. He kind of, he doubles down, and kind of he peacocks, and you see that she can't believe that he's doing this. It's just, so that was really satisfying. I mean, obviously with Taylor's character, that was, I mean, Joyce does something she's never done. She has a one-night stand. She's never done that in her whole life. And she comes in and she's really proud of it. She's kind of done this thing that she's never done before. And only to realize that she's gone about it in a really unprofessional way, which again teaches her, oh, look, she would normally have kind of chastised someone for doing that. And then she realizes, oh, I've just essentially had a relationship with someone that I employ. And it happens. I think she's realizing the more she lives outside of her kind of little corner of academia, there's more scope for making mistakes, but therefore more opportunities to learn. And I think she's learning from her mistakes. She's allowing herself to make mistakes and then learn from them. But the scenes with Hope were really fun. It was fun playing Joyce being totally out of her depth.
And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the relationship between Joyce and Doug, and your chemistry with Jake Johnson, which viewers just ate up with a spoon. First off, just talk about working with Jake and creating or finding that energy with him.
It was just instantaneous. It was so easy. When we had a few rehearsals, right at the beginning before the pilot, and it was just so easy. It was like we'd known each other for years. We'd only met once before, many years ago, very briefly, so we didn't know each other, but it was so satisfying seeing how he was playing Doug and just being like, God, he's so brilliant. I love what he's doing. And then every time that we would have any scenes together, I would look forward to them, because you know how much they'd wind each other up, and it was kind of this sort of love-hate thing. And he's really not her kind of person at all, but she realizes that she needs him, and vice versa. So this kind of reluctant duo. But working with Jake was just so much fun. He's so lovely. He's really funny. He's really relaxed. I don't think I've ever seen someone so relaxed on a set before. It made doing the scenes so much fun. We did, and we'd also, we were very in our characters' corners. Like he was always defending what Doug was doing, and then Ellen would kind of walk up, and we'd be sitting in our chairs just offset, and we'd be having a debate, and she'd be thinking, what she'd say, like, what are you talking about? And we'd be talking about Joyce and Doug, and how I think Joyce is right and he thinks Doug is right, and she'd be like, oh my God, yes. she was very like talking like they're kind of our best friends.
I mean, that's great character work, isn't it? Or great.
Yeah.
That's I love, that's really great to hear. And obviously the relationship is very dynamic, and once again it very much evolves throughout the season. My question is, though, by season's end, would you say that they in a way depend on each other, and if so, in what ways?
I mean, Joyce does depend on Doug to get her magazine out there. The fact of the matter is she hasn't been able to do it thus far until he comes along, and she's made lots of compromises, but the kind of fundamental message of what she's saying is still there. And so she does need him for that, but similarly, the magazine, Joyce's magazine, sells more than any other one that he's ever had. So he realizes that, you see towards the end of the show, he just wanted to move units and just sell magazines, make money. And you see towards the end, it's not just he could just make this magazine with anyone. He finally has to kind of admit Joyce does bring something different, something unique to it that he hasn't been able to do before. And he finally admits that. But Joyce has also been quite naive in thinking that she could just set this up and then go off and do it on her own. There's so much about the business side of it that she hasn't had experience in it, so she doesn't know. So I do think they need each other more than they would like to admit. I think Jake actually put it really well. How did he put it? He said something like, they think they're getting into the ring with someone that they're going to easily beat, and then they realize that their opponent is actually matching them like punch for punch, and they're realizing, oh, they're actually keeping me on my toes more than I thought they would. And they've both thought that. They both thought they could kind of beat the other into submission, and realizing that they are kind of head to head. And I think that's where a lot of the friction comes from as the show goes on, which is what's so satisfying to play about it, because she's so pedantic. And when he says something sarcastic, she kind of willfully ignores that he's being sarcastic and takes him literally, which winds him up even more. and you see Joyce kind of getting a little point in there for winding him up, but then similarly he really still really irritates her. It's very fun to play.
Yeah, and it's such a fun relationship to see play out, and I love the way Jake put it. I think that absolutely nails it. On a final note, looking back on this first season, would you say there's anything that you learned on both a professional and a personal level from working on the show and from having walked around in Joyce's shoes for 10 episodes?
I mean, I suppose on a personal level, just how much you need to kind of not be stuck in your ways, because you know that makes you so much more brittle. I mean, I like to think that I kind of go with the flow on things, but this, it just was fun watching her become more interesting and more likable when she was less kind of in her ways, when she's a kind of better citizen. So that's the nice thing to learn, to kind of. But professionally, I loved working with everyone so much. I know that's such a casual thing to say, but really, it was just the best time. Who was it? It was Eric Edelstein said it wasn't work. It felt like a day at the spa, which is very true. Like, you would be walking around just thinking. I mean, the amount of work that went into it, like the attention to detail with Beth Morgan with the costume, and then with our kind of the design department, that you'd open a drawer and there would be papers from the 1970s and they would be on appropriate paper, and all of there was just detail everywhere that just put you into that era immediately. Just kind of thought you really felt like you were in a publishing house. You didn't feel like you were on set. As soon as you stepped onto the set, you just were surrounded by it. I think there were a hell of a lot of talented people involved in this.
And hopefully we get to see more of that.
I hope so.
Hopefully there is a second season. Let's hope. But thank you so much, Ophelia, for joining me today and for talking about this character and this show. And like I said, hopefully there is a season 2.
Yeah, hopefully. Thank you so much. Lovely to talk to you.